In August 1944, the Allies broke out of their bridgehead in Normandy, trapped 80,000 German troops in the Falaise Gap, and began a breakneck advance across northern France to the borders of the Third Reich. As winter came, both commanders and men believed that the war was almost over. They were in for a rude shock. A massive and wholly unexpected German offensive in the hills and forests of the Ardennes seemed to threaten the Allies with a second Dunkirk, splitting the British and American armies and bundling them back to the Channel coast. It was the final gamble of a desperate man. But should the Allies have been surprised by Hitler's last offensive in the West? For British and American codebreakers at Bletchley Park, 50 miles from London, had given warnings of an imminent attack. Since 1942, the codebreakers had played a vital and top-secret role in the Allied war effort. By the winter of 1944, they were using the world's first programmable computer, codenamed Colossus, to decipher intercepted messages between Hitler and his generals. What did this traffic indicate? On the 12th of December 1944, Adolf Hitler summoned his high command to a conference at the headquarters of his armies in the West. The Führer treated his commanders to a strategic tour d'horizon. He remained buoyant, but in truth, the situation seemed desperate. Germany's cities lay in ruins, pounded day and night by American and British bombers. German war industry, dispersed and remarkably effective until now, was beginning to buckle. Two years earlier, Adolf Hitler had presided over a vast empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Urals. But it had now shrunk alarmingly under Allied assault from east, south, and west. The growing manpower crisis in the German army had brought into being the Volkssturm, the German equivalent of Britain's Home Guard. It might have boosted domestic morale, but it also signaled approaching defeat. Boys and old men soon to be pitched against the T-34s of the advancing Red Army. On the eastern and western fronts, the German army was facing overwhelming odds. It was fighting hard, but bleeding away at the core. In the summer and autumn of 1944, the army had suffered irrecoverable losses of nearly 1.5 million men, 900,000 of them on the Eastern Front. The rest of them had been chewed up in the bitter autumn fighting in the West, where 7 Allied armies were advancing into the Reich itself. To the German High Command, it was clear that defeat was staring them in the face. In July 1944, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, had informed General Keitel, Hitler's Chief of Staff, that the only realistic option open to the German army was that of surrender. Surrender was not a word in Hitler's vocabulary. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox who commanded Army Group B in northern France, was also torn between his duty as soldier to his commander-in-chief Adolf Hitler and his realistic assessment of the enemy forces facing the German army in the West. Rommel had become entangled in the coils of a plot to assassinate Hitler at his East Prussian headquarters. Its failure on the 20th of July 1944 was followed by the trial and execution of the conspirators. Rommel, who was not involved in the assassination attempt, committed suicide rather than face a court-martial. The failure of the bomb plot and Hitler's seemingly miraculous survival convinced the Führer that he was invulnerable. Providence had spared him so that he could inflict a shattering defeat on the Allies. Hitler was an inveterate gambler, and he had one last trick up his sleeve. The war maps he studied at his daily briefings told their own depressing tale. But in September 1944, they had given Hitler the seeds of hope. His gambler's eye had lit on the Ardennes, the densely wooded country in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg through which his panzers had burst in May 1940. The Ardennes were to be the jumping-off point for a drive on the port of Antwerp at the head of the Scheldt estuary. Its capture would force a wedge between the British in the north and the Americans to their south. The Western Alliance would then fall apart. It was true that the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had his hands full controlling unruly generals. In particular, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, was at war with General George Patton, commanding US 3rd Army. Patton and Montgomery's rivalry had begun in 1943, in Sicily, when they had raced each other to capture Messina. It was a race the American had won by a few hours. Monty never forgave him. In character, the two commanders were complete opposites. Montgomery was teetotal and schoolmasterly, Patton the playground bully. They did not see eye to eye. In Sicily, Patton had blotted his copybook when, at a field hospital, he had struck a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Patton's military career had hung by a thread. Patton worked his passage back as the commander of a phantom American army group in southeast England, part of the Allied deception plan which preceded the invasion of Normandy. It was only several weeks after D-Day that Patton arrived in France at the head of the very real US 3rd Army. The one view shared by Patton and Montgomery was a low opinion of General Eisenhower. Patton and Montgomery were fighting generals. Eisenhower was the ultimate desk general. His skills, essential in a coalition, were diplomatic. Patton and Montgomery were no diplomats. Eisenhower had to balance the competing claims of Montgomery in the north and Patton in the south to lead a drive into the Ruhr and onto Berlin, the so-called narrow front strategy. The Supreme Allied Commander fudged the issue by deciding to advance on a broad front, switching the weight of the advance to and fro between the Allied armies. Eisenhower's supply lines were soon dangerously attenuated. The convoys of the Red Ball Express, driving round the clock to supply the divisions racing across France, were stretched to the limit. As the Allied armies drove eastward, the supply problem grew worse. The Atlantic ports and those beyond Normandy remained in German hands. An Allied armor division in the field needed 700 tons of supplies a day. Its German opposite number could fight effectively on a third of that total. The Allies could not land enough supplies across the Normandy beaches to sustain the forces in the front line. Whether they pursued the narrow or broad front strategy, they needed the facilities concentrated in ports like Antwerp to release the full fighting strength of their armies. In September 1944, Montgomery could have solved this nagging equation by concentrating all his efforts on clearing the Scheldt estuary, the gateway to Antwerp, which was still in German hands. The British 11th Armoured Division had liberated Antwerp on the 4th of September. It was essential that its largely undamaged port was brought into use as quickly as possible. Logic demanded that the Allied High Command should concentrate on clearing the German Fifth Army from both banks of the Scheldt. It would be a difficult and unglamorous operation, but it would come to the aid of the Red Ball Express, whose own efforts were consuming 250,000 gallons of petrol a day just to keep moving. The Red Ball drivers, most of them black, were approaching the limits of their endurance. However, Montgomery's customary cautious instincts were overridden by his bitter rivalry with Patton. Instead of clearing the Scheldt estuary, he secured Eisenhower's agreement to an airborne operation to leap across the River Meuse and the Lower Rhine. The aim was to secure the bridges at Nijmegen and Arnhem, the preliminary to an armoured drive into the North German plain and the Ruhr, the heartland of the battered German war economy. The code name of the operation was Market Garden. The drops went ahead on the 17th of September 1944, in spite of a last-minute warning from Bletchley Park that 2 panzer divisions were refitting in the area. The gallant British and Polish paratroops failed to take the bridge at Arnhem. It was not until the end of November that the Scheldt estuary was cleared of German troops and mines, enabling heavy cargoes to sail into the port. By mid-December, it was handling 20,000 tons a day. But even before it had been opened up, Antwerp had become a target for German V-1 flying bombs. Eventually, 6,500 of them were fired at the city in a bid to deny its port to the Allies. Meanwhile, Eisenhower continued to fight a battle on 2 fronts, against the Germans and his own squabbling generals. After the reverse at Arnhem, Patton renewed his demand for a massive allocation of resources to roll up the Germans in the south. Eisenhower remained convinced that for all the strain and stress it visited on him, the broad front strategy eased the political tensions within the coalition he commanded. Others argued that it only increased them. But the front was only broad in parts. Some sectors were seemingly sleepy and lightly held. The war seemed a long way off. One of the quiet American sectors lay in the Ardennes. In 1944, as in 1940, the Ardennes offered German troops the protection of thick forests and narrow valleys, almost impenetrable to surveillance by Allied aircraft. It was here, in country which in 1940 the French and British had considered untankable, that Hitler planned to launch an armoured offensive. Its code name was Watch on the Rhine. Antwerp, as yet unavailable to the Allies as a port of supply, lay only 60 miles from the Ardennes. If it could be seized, the Allied eastward drive would be set back by many months. Moreover, the launching sites for Hitler's new revenge weapon, the V-2 rocket, lay just beyond Antwerp. The V-2 offensive against London began in September 1944. There was no defense against the V-2, and the rockets inflicted considerable damage, as well as lowering the morale of the war-weary British. Now Hitler planned to roll up the Allied armies advancing into the Reich. The Western Alliance, he predicted, would fall apart with a tremendous thunderclap. Germany would then turn east to deal with the Red Army. The plan did not impress Hitler's commanders. Even the tough and fanatically loyal Sepp Dietrich, commander of one of the 2 armies earmarked for the operation, had his doubts. When Hitler unveiled the plan at the end of October, Dietrich complained, "All the Führer wants me to do is to cross a river and then go to Antwerp. All this at the worst time of year when the snow is waist deep, when it doesn't get light until 8 and it's dark again at 4. But the Führer was seeking what the German military called a ganzer Entschluss, a total decision. Preparations for the offensive went ahead. Masked by the thick forests and narrow valleys of the Ardennes, they also went undetected by the Allies. Like the French in 1940, the Allied High Command did not anticipate a threat from this quarter. The French had been fatally wrong, but they had erred in the sweltering heat of early summer, not the depths of winter. In autumn 1944, the Americans were also distracted by their own operations against Aachen to the north, and the Saar and Alsace to the south. The prevailing view in the Allied High Command was that Hitler's army was finished. The main problem for Eisenhower was how to end the war as quickly as possible. But almost ceaseless autumn rain had turned the front line into a morass. The Ardennes lay in the sector of General Omar Bradley's US 12th Army Group. The front on which the German blow would fall was held by only 3 American infantry divisions and 1 armored division. They were strung out on a front of 90 miles. 2 of them had taken heavy casualties in the savage battle of the Hürtgen Forest and had been sent to the Ardennes to recover. 1 was yet to see action. On the enemy side of the Ardennes, the Eifel, the Germans began to concentrate 25 divisions under the overall command of Field Marshal Walter Model. The last surge in German tank production ensured that 10 of these divisions were armored. On the right was Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. In the center, General Hassel von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. On the left, General Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army. With 2 divisions and 2 brigades held in reserve, the force numbered 275,000 men, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 2,600 armored vehicles. In addition, Hitler had approved the use of a Trojan horse of English-speaking Germans. Wearing American uniforms and led by the Führer's favorite commando, Otto Skorzeny, their task would be to spread confusion behind the American lines. German commanders like Manteuffel seemed confident enough, but the force assembled for the Ardennes offensive had grave underlying weaknesses. The SS panzer divisions were up to strength, but some other panzer divisions fielded barely 100 tanks. Infantry numbers had been boosted with Czech and Polish conscripts whose commitment to Hitler was suspect. Fuel for the German army was in short supply. Allied bombing of Germany's synthetic oil plants ensured that the offensive had been allocated only a quarter of its minimum fuel requirement. Hitler's plan, which the Führer controlled down to the last detail, relied on supplies captured from the Americans in the initial phase of the battle. Without them, the offensive would grind to a halt. The German fuel crisis was so serious that a parachute assault behind the American lines planned to precede the attack had to be cancelled. The Allied High Command seemed unaware of the gathering threat. Eisenhower was anticipating his promotion to General of the Army. Near the front line, Marlene Dietrich was entertaining the troops. Montgomery, about to take a spot of leave, was firing off demands that he should be placed in charge of the land battle on the Western Front. Among the troops, there was a feeling that the end of the war was in sight. The Germans might be capable of mounting local, spoiling attacks, but little more. But there was one corner of the Allied war machine in which alarm bells had begun to ring. Its location was Bletchley Park. The codebreakers were piecing together a picture which differed significantly from that formed by the Allied High Command. By this stage in the war, the grounds around Bletchley's Victorian mansion housed 10,000 personnel, nearly all of them civilians. The original huts in which the decrypts were translated and analyzed had been overtaken by a sprawling, concrete encampment whose function was the breaking of German codes and the analysis of the information they yielded. To the end of the war, the Germans were unaware that their top secret messages were being read, often in real time, by the teams at Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park's principal targets were the messages encoded on the Enigma machine. These intercepted messages, broadcast in Morse to be decoded on a second Enigma with the same settings, were Bletchley's raw material. The Germans believed that the Enigma code was unbreakable. But from tentative beginnings in the opening months of the war, the codebreakers had found ways into Enigma. In the process, they built up an organization which, by 1944, was providing Allied commanders in the field with decrypts of thousands of top-secret enemy signals. By the autumn of 1944, Allied bombing had broken up the German landline network, throwing ever greater volumes of Enigma traffic into the air. The detailed picture it painted of the enemy's plans, strengths and weaknesses helped to shorten the war. But it was one thing for Bletchley to provide warnings of enemy intentions and dispositions, and another for the Allied High Command to act upon them. At times of great crisis, Enigma-derived intelligence had made the difference between defeat and victory. But there seemed to be no crisis in the winter of 1944. And vigilant security on Hitler's own communications with his commanders encoded on Lorentz machines with which Bletchley Park's Colossus did daily battle gave no hint of the Führer's plans. At this stage in the war, Allied commanders like Montgomery chose to ignore Enigma-derived information, codenamed Ultra, when it did not fit in with their plans. There had been a recent example. On the 5th of September, Bletchley Park had provided Montgomery's headquarters with warning of the imminent arrival in the Arnhem area of the 2 panzer divisions which were to frustrate Market Garden. The information was confirmed by the Dutch resistance, but Montgomery chose to discount it. As the German army withdrew into the Third Reich, less value was placed on Ultra. It had proved vital when the British were fighting for survival, but now the boot was on the other foot. Germany was believed to be on the point of collapse. But fragmentary evidence of a different picture was being formed at Bletchley Park. As the winter of 1944 drew in, there was a general feeling of expectancy among the British and American codebreakers and analysts working there. Although the German army was barely holding the Allied armies battering at the western gates of the Third Reich, the volume of Enigma intercepts suggested that many important enemy units were on the move. The accumulating evidence was of particular interest to the American codebreakers and analysts working at Bletchley Park. It increasingly suggested activity in sectors opposite the US armies. Intercepted Luftwaffe Enigma traffic indicated that the Germans were building a number of forward fighter airfields on the Western Front. The decrypts also yielded a term unfamiliar to the codebreakers: Blitzeinsatz, or lightning action. Were the new airfields linked to the as yet unknown lightning action? At Bletchley, some of the military advisors in Hut 3 speculated that these signals, accompanied by abundant signs of large-scale supply movements, might be the preliminaries to a surprise attack in the Luxembourg sector. The German railway system also used Enigma, and its traffic was read at Bletchley. The railway Ultra yielded information about the westward movement of troop trains and their destinations, most of which seemed to point to the center of the German line, the rear areas of the Ardennes sector. The Luftwaffe signalers were particularly careless about the security of Enigma. Now they were chattering about the German fighter strength being concentrated at the front. The pieces of the jigsaw were falling into place, but as yet no clear picture had emerged. Particularly striking to the men and women in Bletchley's Hut 3 were German orders to maintain strict radio silence. The feeling among them was growing that something big was brewing. Colossus was hard at work, but decrypts gave no firm indication of the preparations for Watch on the Rhine. In the early summer of 1941, Enigma decrypts had provided the codebreakers with the complete German order of battle as it readied itself to launch Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. But now the German signals gave little away. The German commander-in-chief in the West was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a conservative figure reappointed after being sacked by Hitler earlier in the year. The Allied commanders did not expect von Rundstedt to do anything unexpected. Skeptical of Hitler's plans, von Rundstedt was to spend much of the Ardennes offensive drinking cognac and reading detective novels. At Hut 3, however, a stream of traffic flowing to von Rundstedt from Hitler himself was noted. This seemed to indicate that the Führer was calling the shots, and ominously, Hitler was anything but a conservative military thinker. Early in November, Hut 3 was presented with a series of Enigma decrets in which the German Army Group B requested air reinforcements to counter Allied reconnaissance flights over what they termed certain unloading points in the Eifel, the rugged German-held region immediately east of the Ardennes. The Eifel had an interesting man-made feature, a railway network built by the Kaiser before 1914 with the object of concentrating armies west of the Rhine. It was to prevent Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotting the trains feeding the build-up in the Ardennes that Army Group B had called for the fighter cover. The Americans in Hut 3 were beginning to ask themselves what the Germans were up to. One of them, Don Bussey, warned a contact in US 7th Army intelligence that the Germans were about to launch a major attack into Belgium along an axis running from the town of Malmedy to the city of Liège. His contact did not disagree, but added that he could not speak for the other US armies in the sector, 1st and 3rd. He also noted that 12th Army Group and Eisenhower's headquarters had fuller pictures, and in their judgment, they did not anticipate any offensive. Bussey continued to peer through the keyhole opened up by the railway-derived Ultra, and now reinforced his conclusions with alternative sources. Within a few days, a captured document identified divisions from 47th Panzer Corps positioned in the Eifel on the axis of the town of Bastogne, the key to communications in the Ardennes. Significantly, Allied intelligence had lost sight of this corps, and another, 58th, for more than 2 months. Now one of them had turned up seemingly ready for action. 12th Army Group was informed, but it dismissed the intelligence. The German army was incapable of mounting another major offensive. But the German army had other ideas. The build-up for the offensive, now codenamed Autumn Mist, had been completed. No alarm bells were ringing at Eisenhower's headquarters. The Americans holding the Ardennes continued to enjoy the respite of a quiet sector, but not for long. The German attack went in at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December. After a 20-minute barrage, the storm troops appeared out of the mist. At first, there was panic and confusion in the American lines. In the center, the American 28th Division was quickly overrun, and in the north, the forward elements of 106th Division found themselves cut off. But isolated units held their ground, denying the Germans an early breakthrough to the Meuse. In the north, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army found its way blocked by the US 99th Division. Faced with tougher opposition than he had anticipated, Dietrich decided to shift his 12th Panzer Division south, where the US 14th Cavalry Group seemed to present a softer target. The Germans broke through on a 5-mile front, moving their infantry round the Schnee Eifel, a salient of small villages and forest-covered hills, to outflank the inexperienced US 106th Division. In the center, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was making better progress. On the 16th of December, his tanks had crossed temporary bridges over the River Our. A breakthrough loomed along the Bastogne axis predicted by Don Bussy. The capture of the road junction of Bastogne was now vital to the development of autumn mist. Throughout the day, Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters had failed to appreciate the scale of the attack. Denied air reconnaissance by foul weather and intercept intelligence by strict German radio silence, Bradley decided that this was just a spoiling attack. The American troops fighting for survival in the eye of the hurricane would have told Bradley a different story. Those who had been taken prisoner had no chance. But Eisenhower, the desk general, disagreed with Bradley. Fearing that this was a full-blown offensive, he decided to bring down 2 armored divisions from neighboring formations to stand on the flanks of the German attack. Combat engineers went to work to slow down the pace of the German advance. They toiled in an environment dominated by mud, snow, and mines. Bridges were blown, buying precious time as Manteuffel's panzers moved towards Bastogne. Meanwhile, Skorzeni's commandos had caused much confusion, traveling in captured American jeeps and leaving a trail of sabotage behind them. Constant vigilance was needed to stop them. The American solution was simple. Any German captured wearing a US uniform was shot as a spy. No exceptions were made. After the first 5 days of the battle, little was seen of Skorzeni's commandos. After nearly 48 hours of fighting, the Germans had been balked in the north and south and were already being funneled due west into a salient, the so-called Bulge, which denied them the shortest route to the River Meuse. In an attempt to keep up the momentum, Dietrich had concentrated an armored breakthrough force, Task Force Piper, 100 tanks and 4,000 men of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. One American blocking move after another had frustrated Dietrich from seizing the huge American fuel dumps at Stavelot, which his panzers desperately needed for resupply. Denied access to open country and the fuel with which to exploit it, Dietrich was becoming desperate. Dietrich's drive would depend on Piper and his formidable 70-ton King Tiger tanks, whose 7-inch thick armor made them almost invulnerable. The 29-year-old Piper was a ruthless Nazi and veteran of the savage armored battles on the Eastern Front, but he too quickly ran into trouble. By the night of the 16th, when he should have been racing for the Meuse, Piper was only a few miles from his start line. On the 17th, shortage of fuel prevented him from exploiting the collapse of the US 14th Cavalry Group. Such was the secrecy imposed on the Ardennes offensive that Piper had been unable to reconnoiter the roads along which his armor was struggling. He dismissed them as only fit for bicycles. Fuel was now running out. Seeking a fresh line of advance, Piper skirted the town of Malmedy. It was here, on the afternoon of the 17th of December, that Task Force Piper took prisoner and shot in cold blood 85 men of an American artillery observation battalion. News of the massacre was given instant and wide publicity, and, if anything, helped to stiffen American resolve. Piper was eventually halted not by massively superior force, but by the heroic efforts of American combat engineer battalions, which succeeded in blowing the bridges along his line of advance. As bridge after bridge was blown, Piper was forced onto minor roads in a desperate search for intact crossing points. break in the weather brought with it attacks by Allied fighter bombers. The days of Task Force Piper were numbered. Its commander formed a defensive ring around the village of La Glaise and awaited the inevitable counterattack. By Christmas Eve, Piper was surrounded and out of supplies. His task force had fewer than 800 men left. Their commander gave orders for them to escape as best they could. To the south, the Americans had fought another vital holding action round the road junction of Saint-Vite. From Saint-Vite, a valley route led to the Meuse. By holding the town and Bastogne to its south, the American troops were blocking the Panzer's direct route. Eisenhower now turned to General Patton, commander of U.S. Third Army south of the Bulge. Worried that the German thrust would split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two, he ordered Patton to swing 3 of his divisions north through 90 degrees to drive on Bastogne. Simultaneously, on the 20th of December, Eisenhower placed Montgomery in command of all Allied forces on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Monty, still seething with resentment at Eisenhower, was determined to tweak the Americans' noses. He was described as arriving at the headquarters of U.S. First Army like Christ coming to cleanse the temple. In selecting as his priority the need to secure the line of the Meuse, Monty had an invaluable intelligence weapon up his sleeve. There was no skepticism about Ultra now. The Allies were well informed about the intentions of both panzer armies and the objectives to which they were still groping. The British 30th Corps now joined the Battle of the Bulge. British armour moved down from Belgium to shore up the northern shoulder of the salient. Time was running out for autumn mist. Montgomery calculated correctly that the Germans would punch themselves out trying to batter their way past the 19 American and British divisions now gathered in and around the rapidly lengthening nose of the Ardennes salient. Saint-Vite finally fell to the Germans on the 23rd of December, but they had gained a meaningless victory. The delay imposed by the imperative need to capture the town had allowed the Allies to consolidate the northern shoulder of the salient. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was now closing on the River Meuse, but it had shot its bolt. On Christmas Day, 5th Panzer's advanced units were fought to a halt by US 2nd Armored Division. They were 3 miles short of the Meuse. As the German advance inched forward, the key to the battle was now the town of Bastogne, isolated 30 miles behind their most advanced units. By holding Bastogne, a major rail junction situated on a plateau surrounded by wooded hills, the Allies could disrupt the entire German effort. The town had been garrisoned on the 18th of December by 101st Airborne Division and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division. In 3 days of fighting, it had been isolated by the 2nd Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and 26th Volksgrenadier divisions. In command at Bastogne was Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe. When called on to surrender, he gave the simple reply, "Nuts." McAuliffe reflected growing American confidence. The ferocious weather was beginning to clear, opening up the prospect of resupply by airdrop. The German assault on Bastogne was now driven by desperation. House-to-house fighting raged on the outskirts of the town, as the German besiegers threatened to break in. Bastogne's defenders dug in and even managed to smile for the cameras. Now it was the turn of the exhausted Germans to fall into enemy hands. When the skies cleared, Allied aircraft appeared overhead to pound German columns, littering the roads with the burnt-out shells of trucks and armored vehicles. An armada of transports dropped vital supplies. In contrast, the besiegers of Bastogne had virtually exhausted their ammunition. The Americans had celebrated Christmas with Bastogne still in their hands. On Christmas Day, the Germans had breached McAuliffe's defenses in 2 places before being halted and then driven back. The fighting had been as fierce as anything seen in the Battle of the Bulge. But it represented the last spasm of an offensive contained and soon to be rolled up. On the 26th of December, Patton's armoured spearheads, driving up from the south, joined hands with the defenders of Bastogne. In a logistical tour de force, Patton had swung almost his entire army north to punch a gaping hole through the southern axis of the German advance. Panzer formations, which lay to the west of Bastogne, were now threatened with isolation. Like a boxer bouncing back off the ropes, the Americans began to pound the German armor trapped in the salient. Tough fighting still lay ahead, but the initiative had been reclaimed by the Allies. Montgomery was now able to concentrate on the elimination of the panzer units floundering at the tip of the German advance. Now Hitler acted to extricate the German armor trapped west of Bastogne. On the 26th of December, he ordered a number of units to withdraw. It was too late for 2nd Panzer, which had lost almost all of the 88 tanks and assault guns with which it had begun the offensive. Eisenhower now planned simultaneous attacks from north and south to meet at Houffalize and thus squeeze out the Bulge. Von Rundstedt, sensing disaster, urged Hitler to withdraw. The Führer refused, and on the 1st of January ordered a fresh attack to the south, codenamed North Wind. On that day, the Luftwaffe mounted a massive assault on Allied airfields in Belgium and the southern Netherlands. Having squandered his armoured reserve, Hitler now signed the death warrant of his fighter force. Flying in below Allied radar, the German fighters destroyed over 150 aircraft on the ground. But the Luftwaffe's own losses amounted to some 300 aircraft and 250 irreplaceable pilots. The Allies had made good their wrecked aircraft within 2 weeks. Montgomery, however, considered himself irreplaceable. On the 30th of December, he demanded that Eisenhower place him in sole command of a drive into the Ruhr. Relations between Ike and Monty had almost reached a breaking point. As Eisenhower was the supreme commander and the Americans overwhelmingly the largest contributors to the campaign in northwest Europe, it looked as if Montgomery might have to resign. Somehow things were smoothed over. But a week later, Monty inflamed the crisis within the Allied High Command by claiming at a press conference almost the entire credit for halting the German thrust in the Ardennes. With supreme insensitivity, Monty described the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky I have ever fought. Somehow, he forgot to mention that the Americans were there too. Eisenhower's counteroffensive had begun on the 3rd of January, with the simultaneous attacks from north and south, which would link at Houffalize, 10 miles north of Bastogne. Bad weather delayed the Allied push, but by the 8th of January, Hitler was forced to order the withdrawal of all his exposed panzer divisions. The Allied pincers were closing on Houffalize. To the south, north wind had blown itself out without ruffling the Allies' renewed composure. The crisis had passed, and with it any lingering hope Hitler might have nursed of inflicting a second Dunkirk on the Allies. Desperate defense had been transformed into mopping up. On the 15th of January, the two Allied pincers met at Houffalize. In the first few days of the offensive, the Germans had sent shock waves of panic as far as Paris. Now they came quietly. Once the Allies had joined hands at Houffalize, the salient had been all but eliminated. Within 3 days, the Allied front had been restored. The port of Antwerp had come alive. And supplies were now pouring ashore. Fuel, food, and munitions for the drive into Germany. In the month-long Ardennes offensive, 5th and 6th Panzer Armies had inflicted some 19,000 fatal casualties on US 12th Army Group. They had also taken 15,000 American prisoners. But the cost to the German army in the West had been 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Men who would have been better deployed in dogged defensive battles. "800 German tanks had been destroyed. In November and December, 2,300 tanks had been committed to the Western Front. The Eastern Front, where Germany was fighting for its life, had received only 920. In the same period, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,000 aircraft, some 300 of them in one day, attacking the Allied airfields in the Low Countries. None of these losses, human or material, could be made good. The Allied advance, which had rolled through the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line in the late autumn of 1944, could now continue. It ended in Soviet-occupied Berlin in May 1945, when Montgomery took the salute at a victory parade with Marshal Zhukov, Stalin's battle winner. The Allies could save a victory, but should it have been achieved more quickly? For Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice in the Ardennes should not have come as such a shock. He was known as a gambler. And had the warnings from Bletchley Park been heeded, his last offensive in the West might have stalled on its starting blocks. Instead, the careful accumulation of secret intelligence by the codebreakers did not reach the decision-makers until it was too late. A chance to shorten the war by many months was thrown away, and Ultra denied the opportunity to make the last of its many contributions to Allied victory.